I'm quite sure every person in this room knows Peter Kenyon. He seems to be the most travelled person on the planet. Every time I speak to him, he's in South America or Russia or Asia or India or China, Africa. He's probably one of the global authorities on the voice of the people, power to the people, being the essential part of what we do in terms of public sector decision making. And Peter's sort of talking just on a slightly different topic today in a certain sense. It's not so much about the global sort of situation about power to the people, but about what's happened over in Western Australia with the proposal for the council, say amalgamations, and how it's actually is ignoring the social capital implications of what's involved in people's lives over there. So, without further ado, could you welcome Peter Kenyon?
Thanks very much, John, and thanks for those generous words. I can hardly wait to hear myself speak after all that. I need to say I approached this afternoon with mixed emotion. Firstly, a lot of apprehension. This would have to be the graveyard session of any conference, and looking around, I think most people would like to have a bit of a snooze at the present time. There's a wonderful story of a guy called the Duke of Devonshire who dreamt he was addressing the House of Lords in London and woke up to find he was. And it was straight after lunch, and lunch is does have one of those effects on you. Secondly, I don't know if you're aware of how long any presenter can actually hope to retain the attention of an audience, but Stanford University, which is one of these very prestigious universities, has done lots of research on this, and they claim that under perfect circumstances, i.e. early in the morning, plenty of light in the room, lots of fresh air, no alcohol in the system, people are interested in the topic, you've got a maximum of 9 minutes before people turn off. 9 minutes. Now, as I said, Stanford's a pretty prestigious university. It's not like the University of Melbourne and like that. It's a real university. And this particular university then said, well, look, if it's 9 minutes, what would be much more interesting as a research piece is to work out if people have turned off after 9 minutes, what have their mind shifted to? Now, as I said, this is Stanford. This is a real university. And they did this international research, and they came up with the fact that after 9 minutes, 23% of most audiences were thinking of sex after 9 minutes. They claim when Australians got added to the sample, it jumped to 32%. But that was only because I think a New Zealander was on the research panel. That always biases. But what it does say is that approximately 7 minutes, the majority of you are going to be quite bored with what I'm saying, but you will be having a good time. So that will help us through the afternoon. The other bit of apprehension I have today is simply as I look around the audience, I see a lot of dark suits. And whenever I have one of those in the audience, I love to use, I have a rural background and I love a little bit of humour. Good morning, I'm Alex Sloan, the Seconded Special Projects Liaison Officer in the Regional Coordination Statistics Unit of the Rural Research Department, the Research Division of the Department of Agriculture. Yep, and I'm Bill. And I don't want to know what your business card says, but I just want to associate with Bill in this particular cartoon. I don't come with any expertise. I did spend 8 years heading a government department. I have come from that, but I am now simply, I call myself a community enthusiast. I am a social capitalist. I really believe that whatever the issue, community, not government, not budget, not politicians, but community have the power and often the resources to tackle it. And yet we have created a society where we put community well and truly at the bottom. So I very much come here talking from the community point of view. In contrast to our speaker this morning, I agree that there's two sides to the coin. One of them is about local government change, and the other side I wouldn't put economics or fiscal change, I'd put community empowerment. I think they're the two sides of the same coin. And instead of always looking at where are we going to get the dollars, how do we organise better to more efficiently do things, we need to start expanding the pie in terms of who's engaged and what resources and assets that we're actually mobilising. So I'm coming today, and it's not going to please some of you because I'm going to come from a certain perspective. I also come as a person who was brought up in a little country town that 50 years ago was amalgamated with another council. I need to say that that particular community's never got over that particular amalgamation experience, and there would still be old-timers in that community who would still say we were far better off under the old regime. I'm currently now part of another community. It's the Shire of Kalamunda. For those of you who don't know WA, it's the biggest shire before you go into being cities. It's a group of about 62,000 people. And we are currently being pushed and told we will be amalgamated, and the option is to be amalgamated with the shires of Mundaring and the city of Swan, which by 2031 will have a population of 300,000 people. And we're told that that is good for us. There is no choice in the matter, and it has been decreed that this will be the way that we will be moving. And so I suppose I'm one of those people, and it's why I proudly wear a T-shirt today, as part of that community, to say I'm voting no against this. And we have just closed where the community, much to the annoyance of the government, have basically instigated a referendum within a poll within the community to say, people, what do you think? Because the government certainly ain't going to give you the option to vote on it. And the votes are coming in, and the first electorate has just come through, I think yesterday, shows 81% of people are saying no to kind of like amalgamation. And yet we are being denied that as kind of like an option in the whole process. Do I have my head in the sand? No. I think I'm here to say that it's so easy to opt for amalgamation, because you know what, I think it's a lazy option. I think it's an easy option on paper, whereas I believe strongly that there are a whole pile of other options that we could consider, including kind of like ones that actually see a much greater engagement of community resource, and we tend to ignore that. And the one thing that we constantly want to quote is this is going to be good for us from an efficiency financial point of view. I'm yet to see anywhere where that's actually been demonstrated, but I'm more concerned about the impact it has on the loss of identity, the loss of social capital, and in our case where we will now have one kind of like person who will be representing between 25 and 30,000 people in this thing called local government. I think it's a joke. And I suppose I'm here today to say who really has their head in the sand. That's on the apprehensive side of this afternoon. The positive side, we're actually in Melbourne. Isn't this a great city? Sorry for those of you from Sydney, but this is the best city in the country. I love to be here, and our former Prime Minister Keating said he'd love to be in Melbourne just to perv on the buildings. And I think it is a great city, and I think for me it's just a privilege to be here. So that's one of the real positives of being invited. Any time to be in Melbourne is fantastic. Secondly, this is a conference, and this is about talking about the future. This is about talking about change. And certainly to me, leadership and learning kind of go together. They're inseparable. And we need times like this to come to listen, to debate, to discuss, the dialogue, and get our heads around these issues. And certainly this Future of Local Government Conference has a great reputation for having done that over almost a decade. I also think it's times like this that we suddenly get new thoughts and ways that we can leapfrog. And I love this quote, whoever invented the first wheel was smart, but whoever invented the other three was the genius. And it just seems to me that often we have some thoughts shared from afar and from our local colleagues, and they spark things within us, not necessarily replication, but actually allow us to kind of like leapfrog. And I suppose, again, this conference has a reputation for that. And I just think the speakers we've already had this morning all have kind of like thrown out so many wonderful thoughts in terms of where we might be leapfrogging. The third reason I'm excited is the Future of Local Government Summit. And certainly it has been going on for a number of years. And I do want to, at this time, acknowledge the work of John Hennessy. I have huge respect for John and the work that he's done on this for a long period of time. People like Bill MacArthur and other members of the MAV who've put this on. And I just say, John, it's a great initiative and we appreciate all your efforts in terms of doing it. The one back there in 205 I thought was really significant because these were the two basic questions that were asked. And I found it interesting that there were 7 or 8 major points that came out of that particular event, but 3 in particular that are really important in my work of working in the area of community building were these. Firstly, that the key local government focus needs to be community strengthening and not service delivery. That's an amazing statement, because it ain't the reality. Secondly, a precondition for a better future, local government needs to engage with and win trust and respect from the community. And thirdly, a key leadership role of local government is to enable democratic local decision making and actions and on behalf of the community. So I'm about trying to further local democracy. And so I'm committed to this concept of local democracy and local engagement, how we actually get people involved. And I thought they were three really interesting conclusions at one of the earliest of these summits that were held. I think that thing, as I said, about local democracy is really important, and particularly when we're talking about amalgamation and the impact it has on dynamics of people feeling that they can actually engage in the system. I think it's very, very important in the process. But the other thing that came out of that particular summit was probably the closest I've ever seen local government coming to define what its purpose is. And I actually quite like the vision statement that came out, that local government is valued by all Australians for building strong and successful communities. And I actually think ain't a bad definition of what is ultimately the purpose of local government, to build strong and successful communities. I think the thing we need to debate is, what do such places look like? What do we mean by a strong community, a successful community? But needless to say, there's enough research that kind of like tells us that, and it ain't rocket science stuff what these places look like. And most of them are kind of like to do with people's engagement within the life of that community. So I really admire the work of this conference. I admire what it's done over a long term. It's also helped some of us, and one of the initiatives that I've been working with John on is that the MAV and my organisation, the Bank of Ideas, have been looking at, across the globe, all the evidence and nationally what constitutes these places called strong, successful, vibrant. What do these places actually look like? What type of behaviours actually go on in them? What type of attitudes are prevalent? And I think that's fundamental to understanding our purpose. Because if we understand what builds a strong and successful community, obviously isn't that where we should be directing our efforts? Isn't that where we need to have budget lines? Isn't that where we should be directing, kind of like where we're trying to bring about positive change? And certainly, as you look at the international evidence, there are 8 kind of like critical, kind of like community outcomes that build success or behaviours. The first is that whole thing about engagement. Second is that whole thing about fostering commitment to place. The third is about connections and collaboration. The fourth is about building, knowing oneself and building upon assets. Fifth is about shaping its future. Sixth is about acting with idea and opportunity obsession. Seventh is about embracing change and taking responsibility. And the eighth is generating what is always identified as the most critical factor in the success of any community: leadership, local leadership. And so, again, what's exciting is working on a project where we're saying if these 8 behaviours are kind of like being highlighted over and over and over and over in all the research about vibrant and strong communities, how do we actually start to shape that? What actions do we put in place that actually builds them as kind of like characteristics of community? So you can see where I'm coming from. This is my bag. This is where I think part of this debate needs to focus, not just on the fiscal and what is an efficient way to actually organise. As I said, I'm a community enthusiast, I'm a social capitalist. I believe after family, there is no more important institution in society than this thing called community. And I suppose for me, it's about how do we strengthen this thing called community. And certainly, to me, as I said, local government reform and community empowerment, in my mind, are the 2 sides of the coin that we need to be looking at. I actually think in looking at the second, we find some of the answers to the first, but the 2 cannot be separated. And certainly, we've had a little bit of attention on the death of this woman. We need to also acknowledge she did a lot of good, but also, boy, did she introduce some interesting philosophies into society that have permeated. And one of them, this is the infamous statement, there's no such thing as society, just individuals. And I am one that react against that strongly. I believe community after family is such an incredible thing. And therefore, to see local government, its role is to build strong and successful communities. And how do we get our mind around that? So that's my passion. I'm interested in what these type of places look like, how they function, and how we make them happen. And there's no level of government more responsible or in a better position to influence the development of that than kind of like local government. And so I'm really one of those people who is passionate about keeping local in the equation. I'm not interested in regional big government, I'm interested in local government that's actually able to influence those things that at the end of the day are the things that matter most in the lives of people. And certainly this thing called social capital. I mean, it's so easy to keep talking about financial capital. It's so easy, as we've heard about the debate on education, all about human capital. But you know what? The thing that actually makes the biggest difference in our communities is social capital. All the other capitals are important. This one, I think, is a little bit more important. And I suppose the person who's actually helped us understand it, and I believe he spoke at one of these conferences, John, is this guy Putnam. I don't know how many of you have read or heard Robert Putnam speak, but I always envy this guy. I mean, this guy had the ultimate job in life. Could you imagine for 20 years, his major job was to wander around Italy? Could you imagine for 20 years just wandering around Italy? Imagine all that red wine he knocked off and all those museums he wandered in and out of. I really envied it. But he did have a real job. And that was, how come after 20 years of restructuring Italy into these new regional governments and giving them all the same financial resources to start with, why was it that after 20 years the disparity was actually unbelievable? Now, was it just because of local circumstances? Was it because of politics? Was it because some were more naturally endowed with resources than others? That was actually Putnam's job, is to work out, how do you come up with this type of disparity? If you all start out with the same financial resource, how do you end up this way? And his conclusion was, look, all of those things we mentioned actually matter. But you know, at the end of the day, it was actually this thing that he popularised. He didn't invent the term, it's been around for 100 years, but this term social capital is the term that he's actually popularised. He said at the end of the day, a place like Bologna is not just the richest region in all of Italy, it's the richest region in all of Europe. And a lot of it comes back to the traditions of people, collaboration, relationships and connections that actually make kind of like the difference. And so if he said, if you're really interested in the economic future of a community and its social future and its environmental future, the thing you've really got to start looking at is this thing called social capital. And he goes on to say that if you are interested in things like better educational outcomes, if you're interested in safer streets, if you're interested in people living longer lives, well, actually start with social capital. Don't actually think that it's more police on the street that's going to lead to more safety. It's actually about people knowing each other and acting. In fact, there's a correlation we've discovered about people knowing each other's first name in a neighbourhood and the level of crime within that particular neighbourhood. You know, the thing that I've actually found absolutely amazing about this Gonski debate that we've been having is that if you actually gave a school a choice, about $5 million more for more teachers and more educational resources, or could come up with a strategy that actually engaged 400 more families and parents in the life of their kids' school, which one would lead to the better educational outcomes? It's the latter. All the evidence tells us it's the latter. But I actually haven't heard that as part of the debate. It's all been reduced to money, 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 and what are we going to put into it? And it just seems to me there's a balance in the discussion that we're going to bring. This thing called social capital actually makes an incredible difference. And the same we know when it comes to people's health and whatever. It is not just all about healthy food, but people's relationships and connections at the community level. And if we're interested in the health budget, we need to be interested in social capital, because if there is a way we can see significant reduction, we can start to do things. Probably the ultimate social capitalist in the country, Tim Costello, kind of like has really given us some very stark reminders about the importance of kind of like social capital in the world we live in. And if you haven't read this book, it's well worth getting. Andrew Lane actually did his PhD at Harvard under Robert Putnam. He then came back and he was the Professor of Economics at ANU, and then he won one of the Canberra seats. He's a Labor member in the Federal Parliament. I think he recently got appointed as the Parliamentary Secretary for Julia Gillard. That would have to be the kiss of death. But he is a good writer, and he is a very good economist, and he is a very good sociologist. And he's come out with a book called Disconnect, where he looks at this country for the last 40 years and what's happening in it. And those generalisations that I put on the side there really summarise what the book is actually about. He gives you all the statistics for it. And what's he telling us? Well, we ain't connecting like we used to. We actually have people now over for dinner about half as often as we did 10 years ago. We're likely to be on our parents, friends and citizens group at the local school about half as often as we were 7 years ago. We're likely to be on a family picnic half as often as we did 5 years ago. And he gives us some really stark facts about our connection with each other. And I suppose the reality is that we've got to begin to see that these are the challenges that we need to kind of like factor in. We only have to look at local government, and these are the figures out of WA. I mean, basically pretty pathetic. People have the choice of kind of like electronically voting, walking into the booth. There's a whole pile of ways, and still we're struggling to get 30% of people in our system of voluntary voting and whatever. But look at the interest in actually participating in terms of kind of like this important level called local government. And it seems to me that we do need to begin to ask, what is it we're doing to rebuild what is really this fabric or this glue that holds people together? Because, you know, at the end of the day, it's a bit like an Australian rules football game, where 30,000 people who need the exercise turn up to watch 36 players who don't. And it seems to me, we seem to be very content to continue to run. And I don't think this is actually a healthy way to run any of our institutions. I don't think it's healthy that over a third of our Generation X haven't even bothered to sign up to vote. They haven't even registered. The fact that only 1 in 3 neighbours, according to Curtin University last week, trust their neighbours. I mean, these need to be issues that local government takes serious. If you're not trusting your neighbour, in fact, 2 out of 3 people don't trust their neighbours, it's a pretty sick society, isn't it? Sick community. How do we start to change that? And if it can be changed, these are things at the local level. You know, there is incredible levels of exclusion actually happening within Australian society. And again, it's at that local level that we have the capacity to kind of like begin to change it. And again, it ain't that difficult if you kind of like listen to people like the Hugh Mackays and the Tim Costellos of this world. It's basically about structure and getting people together. And if we're going to restructure our institutions so it's less likely people come together, then we've got to ask, are we heading in a decent direction in terms of where we're at? Because fundamentally this is actually about creating opportunity to get people together in terms of where we're actually at. And so to me, this thing called amalgamation, if I needed a cartoon to kind of like capture what I think of it, that is reality. And I'm being pretty biased about where I'm coming. I'm certainly painting where I'm pinning my colours. I'm not interested in people getting smaller. I'm interested in more engagement. I'm interested in people beginning to take some responsibility for the future rather than sitting there saying, when are they, and I've never quite ever worked out who they is, are going to kind of like sort things out and whatever. And so in WA, we've had this famous kind of like report done. I found it just amazing that right at the start, there wasn't the option of kind of like considering anything but reducing the number of councils. That was kind of like built in to kind of like the mandate that they were actually given. And I suppose the major recommendation, there were a whole pile there, but one of them is fundamentally that we should reduce our number of metropolitan councils from 30 to 12, and even more scary that it should be based on the WA Planning Commission's directions for 2031 in terms of how we structure it. I mean, that is a very scary thing given their track record in terms of saying, we have these major activity centres. So for a place like me, and if you don't know, Perth, Kalamunda is a bit like the Blue Mountains, it's a bit like the Adelaide Hills, it has some of those, a bit like the city of Onga-Paringa, it's got some of those suburbs coming out from the east of the city, low income, state housing commission areas initially, through to some very small little fruit towns, country towns and whatever. A proud community, very much a community that's had a strong identity for well over 100 years. And the argument is that Midland is our activity centre and therefore we should be reshaped into a local government that actually is built around this place down the hill that really isn't the centre of life for people who live in Kalamunda. So I suppose that's where I'm very supportive. And our council, to give them credit, were willing to stand up and say, we object to this and we want to kind of like fight it. The other thing that's scary is also we do have this thing called the Daydor Amendment that a famous Tom Daydor, the member for Subiaco, kind of like got through Parliament, and again, things like that are going to be ignored or changed. So, as a community, we certainly have campaigned strongly to say, listen, this is worth getting out and voting and kind of like basically kind of like voting no. And certainly the Shire there have taken a very strong, that this ain't a smart move, either economically, but above all from a sense of identity and from a social capital point of view. Now this is the scary bit. This is our local member. He is also the Minister for Planning in the Barnett government. he comes out and says, this is a frivolous activity. Fancy asking people in a referendum what they want. And you're going to spend $80,000? Well, that $7 million we promised you during the state election, well, that's now all in jeopardy because we consider you wasteful of resource because you dare ask the people what they would want. Now, I find that, when we're really trying to build strong local democracy, a pretty scary thing for a minister of a government to come out and claim holding any form of poll is a frivolous waste of money. They are kind of like the emotional activities, and despite all of that, as I said, the votes are starting to be counted, and the first electorate that came through, the northern one, showed an 81% of people actually voted in favour, against, of kind of like amalgamation. So to me, this is an incredible issue that we do need to kind of like think through. Let's not just get on the bandwagon and suddenly think it is the only option. I actually think we've often been confronted, and I work with probably 1,500 communities across the country. I crisscross this country a lot. I need to say that if a vote was taken in Victoria, despite 20 years of the Kennedisation of local government here, I reckon over 70% of rural communities would de-amalgamate. That would be my bet. We've seen it just happen in Queensland. We have never, ever given these communities the chance to do it. Now, this is interesting, this whole thing about big is better stuff. This is this academic that came out a decade ago claiming, we restructured the sugar industry by paying people to get out. We restructured the dairy industry. We need to get rid of these towns because I think any town under 4,000 is unsustainable as a community. So we should actually pay people to leave their town and close all these small towns down. Again, the reality of that. And we have got amazing examples across this country of little places of less than 500 people who offer a quality of life to people that's absolutely amazing in terms of what they've done. So today we've had some powerful words shared with us, and I particularly really enjoyed Rowena's and our guests from overseas. Some of those words that came through, I think, need to be the language we need to start debating as well. Collaboration, cooperation, connections, the critical 3 C's that have to kind of be part of all of this. And for people who are threatened by that whole thing about sharing power, I love that comment about sharing power, you get more power. I do think we've got to start learning this stuff. And so instead of just opting for this easy option called amalgamation, let's get a bit serious in the debate about facilitating conversation and idea generation around a whole pile of other things. The innovation stuff we heard about from Rowena today, and the resource sharing, it's already going on. My council is part of the Eastern Metropolitan Regional Authority. They have already worked out things that are smart to be done across a region as opposed by one local government. We've got great examples of resource sharing going on. How do we start expanding on that rather than kind of like throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Issues to do with partnerships with the business community and a lot of other groups who could contribute in terms of a lot of things. The whole issue of social community enterprises. We heard a bit about what's happening in the UK. We've got a strong history in this country of doing that. You only have to look at the most exciting community economic movement of the last decade, called the community banking movement, where we now have 300 communities, and some as small as a little town like Muckenbudden with less than 500 people, managed to kind of like pull off and establish their own bank. Not one of those banks has fallen over. It's an amazing story. And in a decade, what have they done? They've given back over $100 million to kind of like their communities. It's an incredible story of social and community enterprise. And again, there's a whole pile of other things that we could partner from local government with communities. That whole thing about pushing, that whole thing about the MP thing, yes, in my backyard. How do we get people standing up and starting? Putnam reckons the most radical thing we can do is get neighbour talking to neighbour. Well, look, there's a whole pile of good things happen when you start doing these things. And then there's a whole pile of those funding things. As we've heard, there's a global trend towards localism and community empowerment. And yet, I believe amalgamation will kind of like take us in the other direction. It's worth looking at what we're seeing happening overseas. And as I said, look in our own backyard about this incredible movement that we've seen in the last 10 years. And look at the way that they are now starting to make some of those kind of like strategic decisions about community futures that once were the preserve of local government. You go to the little local government of Plantagenet down there in WA. Here is a pretty decrepit health kind of like system. They couldn't keep a doctor. But here's a bank who's making now up to close to $1 million a year as a community dividend. You kind of like then go to Bendigo Bank, or making $100,000, a year, but then go to the Bendigo Bank and say, why don't you lend us $1 million and we'll pay you back $100,000 a year. And with that $1 million went to local government and said, why don't you put in $1 million? And with that they went to the state and the feds and ended up with $4 million, and the result is an incredible state-of-the-art health service in that town. Now that didn't come from local government, that came from the community bank. This came from directors, ordinary people who make up that, sitting saying, how are we going to spend that $100,000 profit that we want to give back to the community every year? They're thinking strategically. Or or Tumba in New South Wales, where the other week I heard this amazing story where are they putting their money? Into local leadership development. And what are they doing? Every 2 years, every year 11 and 12 student is supported to walk the Kokoda Trail. This is all about building local leadership. And you listen to people on their bank board, they just rave about the impact that over a 6-year period has had to building leadership within the town. You can imagine where every one of you young people have had a kind of like an experience like that, what it does for long-term leadership development. And so all I'm saying is we've got some exciting stuff happening across the country just through that movement. In my own community, over and over, amazing examples of where people have picked up. This is a wildlife thing set up by one family. It now has over 400 volunteers, now employs kind of like 20 people, has a budget close to $2 million a year. How is it done? Purely through community and a few passionate people coming and saying, this is something I care about and let's do it. Or the 4 women down to one of our schools who were horrified that 60% of the school population was turning up without breakfast every day. And they said, you know what, we could do something about this. And the result is they've now got a 5-day-a-week breakfast club that's been adopted now by 140 other schools across Western Australia. You know, what I've discovered is there's nothing more powerful than a community discovering what it cares about. And if we can only link into this, it's amazing. One of the things that I love is that we, in our community, decided that this thing called Schoolies Week is an embarrassment. Fancy telling our Year 12s after 12 years of education, we're so proud of you, and the only option we've got for you is to go off to Rottnest Island for a week of drinking and bonking, and we call that your way to celebrate. Anyway, a group of people came together and said, hang on, let's do something better. And so we now offer our Year 12s in our 6 high schools the option. It's a week at Rottnest, drinking and bonking. So many of the boys are not interested in the second option, they're happy with the first. But the second option is come with us to East Timor for 2 weeks and help to rebuild a village trashed by the Indonesians when they left. Start rebuilding the health centre. Last year they dug a trench to lay a water pipe for 2 kilometres, so 40 families didn't have to walk 2 kilometres every day with a bucket and whatever. You know, that type of global citizen type action is huge. Now, every year now, for 6 years, we've been sending up to 20 of our young people up there. It costs close to $100,000 a year to do that. And you know what? Every year the community raises the money to do it. It's never received 1 cent of state, local or federal money. Whatever the issue, community's the answer. And I suppose the one I'm proudest of in my community is 14 groups have come together with the support of our council and launched a thing called All We Need Is Right Here. And what it's about is about highlighting what a fantastic place we live in, and we're incredibly asset rich. We're sick of kind of like just identifying what's wrong in the place or the needs of it. What this is all about is trying to discover the assets, connect those assets, make those connected assets work and begin to celebrate what an incredible place. You know, within a 12-month period, we've actually generated a whole pile of activities that conservatively would have cost the local government $2 million to deliver in terms of community building. Putting together the most innovative website based on Portland in the United States called Bright Neighbour, where people across a community of 60,000 are now able to share ideas and things that they want to give away and things they want to contribute to and whatever. Putting together a website that really just becomes one of those incredibly sharing type experiences, one that captures the stories of families, ones where people can share their skills and whatever. Linked in with the Bendigo Banks, one where, again, this Plan B, where people are putting up ideas they want to see happen, and people are using cloud sourcing funding and giving their ideas. It's amazing the impact this could have. Yesterday I had the privilege of being at a picnic with 200 young mums with 300 kids just coming together in a park. And you know what? That was all pulled together by 4 women just using the social networking, getting people together to have a celebration of young motherhood, but let's do it together and let's celebrate this great park. You know, a group of young mums came out and put out a calendar called the 50 Things That Every Kid in Kalamunda Should Do by the Age of 12. You know, printed 7,000. We've got 3 businesses to fund it. They're about to go into their 3rd print run. All the time, not a cent from local government's gone into this. This is people coming together, doing it and finding partners to make it happen. We've got another team putting together an asset register and using a TripAdvisor style of thing for all the 82 green spaces in the community. There's a whole pile of things that we traditionally did in local government that community can do themselves. We've got a big idea campaign running through 8 cafes, getting people to share their ideas about what they think could make their community a better place and so on. We discovered this group called the Big Help Mob. They're just these young people say, we don't want to be on a committee, but listen, give us an opportunity to do things and we'll come in. And in 5 hours, they built a community garden for a church that didn't have a person capable of probably pushing a shovel into the ground. And together, they actually used a church with an acre of land who dreamed of a community garden and their skills and kind of like did it. The best thing is we've launched this thing called Get to Know the Neighbour. So if you're willing, and again through the support of an IGA, if you're willing to have 6 neighbours over, half of which we say would be good if you didn't know, we can get a $60 voucher from the local IGA to help buy the food. Or a dozen people get $100. Want to have a street party? You can have $200. Amazing. It's called bribery. But boy, people are suddenly discovering streets are coming alive. It doesn't need to be done. This is volunteers who are doing this stuff. And boy, it's having a huge impact. Council have been incredibly supportive of this whole initiative and a part of the partner in making it. And through it, we've probably generated an additional $2 million in resources back into the whole process. And finally, can I say, you only have to look at what we've gone through as a nation to see that actually it's not the big bureaucracies that are able to deal with things like what we have seen with fire and seen with earthquake in Christchurch. You know, I've spent so much of the last 2 years in Christchurch in the rebuilding of this place. And the stories I hear about ordinary people who kind of like stepped up and have started to do things, just like, you know, September 11th. That was an appalling illustration of how bureaucracy has responded. But it was homeless people on the streets who mobilised that kind of like evacuation of Manhattan Island, and the stories you hear of the way that communities. I've just come back from Cuba. It's just amazing there that a lot of the stuff based on the whole philosophy of altruism of this particular guy and some of the stuff that they've done. And they have there what are called committees for the defence of the revolution at the local level. Well, it's interesting at Katrina, when that hit the south of America, 1,900 people lost their lives, mainly through incompetence of the bureaucracies. 1,900 people in a so-called civilised country. When one of more force, 2 months later, hits Cuba, through their committees at the local level, they moved 2.5 million people and they lost 4 people. Big difference in terms of the ability of local people to mobilise. And I suppose the story I want to share is this is what's possible. You know, this is Christchurch. Here's a young guy, 21 years old, who puts up his hand and says to the authorities and the council on the day, I want to volunteer. As soon as he heard there was an earthquake there in the first September one, I want to help. And they said, well, what skills have you got? Anyway, they look at their sheet and said, we don't think we can use you. You don't actually have the skills that are actually needed. So what does he do? He does use the skills he's got. It's called using his social media. And what does he do? He mobilises 13,000 other young people to come in instantly and call the student army and to start that massive clean-up. And here's a guy who the bureaucracy and council could not kind of like cope with, but he managed over 2 weeks, on average, each day, to mobilise 13,000 young people who gave their time to begin to clean up that particular city. It's an incredible story of what is actually possible. And the exciting thing is that apparently he's standing for mayor at the coming election. So that is very exciting in terms of it. And the final one, wake up Sunday morning. You know, we talk about the health budget. Here's a young guy who at 6 years basically led the life of an alcoholic, but at age 22 said, I'm sick of waking up with a headache and what it's doing to my hip pocket, comes up with this blog about challenging his contemporaries to think about giving up alcohol for 2 months and beginning to see the impact it has, kind of like on that Sunday morning, and what it does to your wallet. You know what? He's got 10,000 other young people now trying it out. Now, a Department for Health, which should be called the Department for Sickness, cannot give me statistics like that. 10,000 young people caught up simply, here's a guy using what he's capable of doing through social media. So I suppose, look, all I want to reiterate is that comment this morning, become a partner with the community, stop looking at it as your parent, begin to see that part of the future of local government is about mobilising this incredible thing, and in the process, actually achieving what I think is the purpose of local government, building strong and successful communities. In closing, that wonderful story of that French count who went there, and what did he observe about the Americans back there in the 18th century? Those three incredible things. And to me, that story captures what the power of community is all about. There's nothing more powerful than community discovering what it cares about, and whatever the issue, community does have the potential to contribute. And my final grenade to chuck into the audience is this: any fool can make things bigger, more complex, more violent. It takes a touch of genius and a lot of courage to move in the opposite direction. Thanks very much.